It's November 25, 2019, and this is episode 21 of the Paperback Warrior podcast.
Welcome to another episode of the Paperback Warrior podcast. We're happy to be with you once again. We've got a really cool episode planned today. Tom's going to talk about a really interesting feature. I'm going to let him introduce it, but first we just want to remind you that our flagship site is paperbackwarrior.com. You'll see a ton of reviews there. Check out the right-hand side. There's going to be a lot of tags there you can click on, lots of genres, lots of authors, tons and tons of reviews there. Read them, let us know what you think, and follow us on all the social media, and we got new reviews every weekday, Monday through Friday at 6 a.m. Eastern Time, and then archive reviews that post every afternoon at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, and a lot of archive reviews and things like that we post on the weekends. But yeah, Tom, tell us what we have on tap today.
Today we have a feature on sleaze fiction. Sleazy.
Oh.
And if you're not interested in sleaze fiction, I would encourage you to tune in because, one, I'm not particularly interested in sleaze fiction, but I think I can tie it in very nicely to why it's important to know about it if you're a fan of hard-boiled fiction and noir crime fiction. I'm going to be doing a review of The Widow by Ori Hitt, and you're going to be reviewing a classic by Ed Lacey called Lead with Your Left. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that was a good one.
Cool, and we'll wrap up the month of November at the end of the episode, since this is our last episode in November. But you've been doing some shopping. You got yourself a complete set of something, didn't you?
Yeah, I did one of those little transactions on one of the Facebook group pages, and affordably, I was able to purchase books 1 through 60 of the Hard Case Crime series. This is an ongoing series of novels that was created by Bill Arday. He commissioned really attractive cover art.
It's Charles Arday.
Is it Charles Arday?
Yeah, 100% of it. Charles.
Oh, yeah, Charles Arday.
Ardai.
I can't read my writing. But yeah, he created these really attractive books with cover art. Most of them are reprints, but there's a few original novels sprinkled in, mostly, I guess, written by the owner himself under the name Richard Alias.
Yeah, Aleas.
And
clever pseudonym.
He's got another one, I think, thrown in there with his own name, but I hear those aren't very good. But Tom, these are in mint condition. They're crisp, shiny. They smell new. They've never been read. I'm really happy to get them.
I need to ask you the big question, because hard case crime books are among the most attractive books sold in the past 20 years. When you shelved them, did you shelve them in author order, or did you put all your hard case crime together so you got this white and gold and red beautiful section?
It's funny that you asked that, because I was going to ask you the same thing. I was going to ask you and our listeners, do you want to break the books up and insert them into your library alphabetically by author's last name, or show off the uniformity of having all those little yellow squares and guns and a smooth horizontal line? I'm so torn over this.
So we're recording in my library today, not yours like we have in the past, and so I'm there's no big secret. I put everything in author order. But knowing you, I'm picturing a giant stack of hard case crime books just stacked in the corner while you're mulling over what to do. Am I right?
Right now, I've got them on top of my shelves in line. But there's one of the books, and I think it's a Robert Bloch book.
It's a double.
It's a double, and on the bottom it has a yellow square, so it looks completely off from the rest of them.
And it's driving you crazy, isn't it?
Well, my girlfriend's OCD, and she hates walking into my office now because she sees it out of the corner of her eye. But these books, this particular run through 1 through 60, think about this. These are authors like Lester Dent, Steve Fisher, Lawrence Block, Donald Westlake, Robert Bloch, Max Allan Collins, Mickey Spillane, your buddy Cornell Woolridge, David Goodis, and Charles Williams, just to name a few. But, man, great run. I'm really glad to have these. So,
Hard Case Crime did such a great job at ferreting out the best of the 1950s crime fiction and reprinting it with these gorgeous covers. I have to say, lately they've been letting me down. They got the Quarry books, which are great. They're a favorite of mine. And anything Donald Westlake wrote, if the guy wrote something on the back of a napkin, they're reprinting that. But a lot of the stuff they're releasing these days, one, they've gone to trade paperbacks, which I can't stand. I like the smaller mass market paperbacks, but I'm also just let down by their output.
What was the big surprise that they unveiled like 2 months ago?
Brian De Palma, a book that was probably written by the co-author anyway. And so they made such a huge deal of that. And I was thinking, oh my God, could it be Harry Whittington? Could it be somebody that we really love? And it was a Brian De Palma novel co-written with someone else.
Yeah.
Anyway, my criticism of Hard Case Crime comes from a place of love because I love their publications. I love the company. I love everything about them. I just want them to get back on the right track. There are so many books just surrounding us here in this very room that haven't been reprinted since 1958, haven't seen the light of day since then. And if they're just willing to take the time to get the rights, or hell, half of these books are probably in public domain by now, they could be printing some amazing stuff, but they're not. They're going for like, I don't know, just bestseller Joyce Carol Oates books.
Do you think that they made so much money off the 2 Stephen King books that they don't have their eyes on the prize anymore?
I don't know. I know the Stephen King books definitely just back a Brinks truck up to them.
Yeah.
They did very well with those.
I'd love to know how that came about, but that's a story for another episode.
Yeah, Charles Arday has written essays about it. It's pretty interesting. It's worth Googling.
Yeah, cool.
So we move on to the feature?
Yeah, go for it. I'm interested to hear this.
Okay, so we're going to be talking about sleaze fiction. And I'll start out with the caveat that I'm not an expert at all about this genre. In fact, I had no idea the genre even existed until I started collecting pulp and genre fiction a few years ago. But I started noticing eBay listings for sleaze fiction were commanding top dollar, and people were going to great lengths to shoehorn the word sleaze into their listings on eBay. So let's define the term. These were paperbacks that use sensationalism, particularly in the cover art, to push the boundaries of what was considered to be acceptable content in paperback fiction. Mostly we're talking about sex and novels of the 1950s and 60s and beyond. But we're not talking about hardcore porn books by any stretch of the imagination, particularly in the 50s and 60s, because the publishers of these books did a nice job of making the books look sexy and titillating enough to draw in the mostly male readership, but not so graphic that they're going to be relegated to underground porno shops or risk violating obscenity laws. And these obscenity laws were no joke in the 1950s. Keep in mind that pornography was illegal in most places in the U.S. So if you put out a straight-up porn book like we would think of it today, you ran the risk of getting like the drugstore owner or the bookseller thrown in jail, plus the publisher and the author. So a lot of what we call sleaze novels of the 50s and 60s were really mispackaged mystery or romance novels made to look like sex books from the lurid covers. The content of these books were mostly R-rated, not X-rated. The stories never got totally graphic, like a letter to Penthouse Forum or something like that. There's a lot of heaving breasts and bras falling to the ground and couples stumbling into bedrooms, and then the scene just fades to black when you read these books. There were a ton of publishers who dipped into the genre. The most popular and collectible were Beacon and Midwood. They were like the McDonald's and Burger King of this genre. Beacon was owned by Universal Publishing Company, a business that had several imprints. Beacon later evolved into a company called Softcover Library. Midwood was published by Tower Publications, who did a lot of crime and adventure books we remember under the Belmont Tower imprint, right? Greenleaf was another successful sleaze publisher, and their books were a little more sexually graphic and were a little less misleading about what the contents of the books contain. By 1970s, the gloves were off. America had lost its innocence, and these publishers were getting way more graphic in their content. These become really just straight-up porno novels in the 70s. But I think the 50s and 60s are the most academically interesting for the sleaze fiction folks who want to study this. And we're not a porno book podcast. Let's stay focused on the 50s and 60s. So,
yes.
What's interesting to me is that the authors, many authors who from the crime and adventure fiction genre, who got their start and had career, or had career diversions, we'll talk about that, into the world of sleaze fiction. Let's highlight some of the people who started out writing sleaze fiction. First is a guy who comes up a lot in this podcast, Lawrence Block. He wrote a ton of these books, starting in 1958 and well into the 1960s, many of them under the pseudonym of Sheldon Lord. But you got to be careful because there were also other authors using the Sheldon Lord pseudonym. He also wrote lesbian books for Midwood under the name of Jill Emerson. Block's first published novel in 1958 was called Carla, under the Sheldon Lord pseudonym for Midwood. It was about a nymphomaniac, but it was basically just a romance novel with very veiled sex scenes. Block has embraced this part of his career. Other guys hide it, they deny they wrote it. Block has made his content from this era, the sleaze fiction era, available right now in paperback reprints and on ebooks under his Classic Erotica series, available on Amazon or anywhere, or I think he runs a private bookstore of his stuff too. They also reprints a lot of the original art. Another author who was doing the same thing at the same time was Donald Westlake, who we know very well from the Richard Stark Parker series. In fact, Block and Westlake became friends when they were struggling writers in New York writing these adult sleaze novels as they were getting started. They even collaborated on 3 books, with the best of them known as Sin Hellcat, written under the pseudonym of Andrew Shaw for Nightstand Books, right? These are like two huge...
Nightstand Books.
Yeah, I know. These are 2 huge authors in the world of crime fiction, 2 crime fiction grandmasters who collaborated on 3 books. I'm told the other 2 books are crap, but I'm told Sin Hellcat's very good. It's also available now under Block's Classic Erotica library with a reproduction of the original cover art. It's about a married advertising executive named Harvey who makes a whore into his mistress. But the story becomes a blackmail story when he's confronted with nude pictures of himself having sex with the girl. And as you can imagine, with the collaboration between Block and Westlake, these guys were so good. This thing veers pretty heavily into crime fiction territory. I got it on my Kindle. I'm going to try and read it, and we'll review it in 2020. My understanding is that Block and Westlake, they had a couple other books as well, one called So Willing, and the other called A Girl Called Honey. But everyone says that Sin Hellcat's the best of the bunch. Another guy who did a lot of work in this genre was Robert Silverberg. He wrote a bunch of these books under the pseudonyms of Don Elliott, Lauren Beauchamp, or Beauchamp, I don't know, David Charlton, and Mark Ryan. People in the know say that the quality of the Robert Silverberg book in the sleaze genre was head and shoulders better than his peers. Some have real crappy covers like Sin Servant, a nightstand book under the name Don Elliott. Others have amazing covers like Sin on Wheels. I have a copy of that. It's a Midwood book under the name of Lauren Beauchamp that promises to be the uncensored confessions of a trailer park tramp. It was reprinted as an ebook by those Planet Monks guys. Our friends at Stark House have reprinted 4 of Silverberg's Don Elliott sleaze books as doubles: Lust Queen and Lust Victim in one volume, and Gang Girl and Sex Bum in another volume. And they're also available on Amazon, or you can go to Stark House Press to get those. Most of the authors who dabbled in the genre did it at the beginning of their careers, right? When they're just getting started, trying to get themselves off the ground. One exception to that would be the king of paperbacks himself, Harry Whittington, who wrote 38 sleaze novels under pseudonyms during this mid-career slump he had in the mid-1960s when he still had to put food on the table for his family. Lynn Monroe, a collector and critic, does a real nice rundown of these missing 38 books from Whittington's catalog on his blog. If you Google Harry Whittington, The Missing 38, you'll see Lynn Monroe's article. What's interesting about Whittington's foray into sleaze fiction is that the books are so hilariously mislabeled. I read 2 of them, and they're both just solid crime novels, consistent with his 1950s output. I reviewed 2 of these sleaze novels on the Paperback Warrior blog. In 1956, Harry Whittington wrote a manuscript called The Crooked Window. It went unsold for a decade until March 1966, a decade later, when he adapted it into a nightstand book called Blood, Lust, Orgy. The original 30,000-word novella was later published that year in Shell Scott Mystery Magazine's November 1966 issue under the original title. Anyway, I found a copy of the Shell Scott magazine containing the novella for a nice price on eBay, and the lusty paperback tends to fetch insanely high collector prices. But anyone who reads this book expecting a bloodlust orgy, it's going to be extremely disappointed because The Crooked Window is just this very compelling, benign mystery story, typical of the digests of the 1960s. It opens with this character named Bill dropping his wife off at the department store while he's waiting in the car. She's doing some shopping, and she never comes out of the department store. So it's really just a missing woman story. It's okay. It's nothing great. It's certainly not his best work. In 1963, Harry Whittington sold a book called To Find Cora to a sleaze publishing house after the novel had been rejected by Fawcett Gold Medal. The book was later released under the salacious title Cora is a Nympho. 3 years later, the plot was slightly revised and resold as Flesh Snare by J.X. Williams, published with this tawdry and misleading S&M cover. Anyway, in 2009, Starkhouse reprints To Find Cora as a 3-book compilation along with 2 of other Whittington's rarities. And this really great introduction by this guy named David Lawrence Wilson, detailing Whittington's foray into 1960s porno books. By today's standards, the sex in To Find Cora is extremely tame, but it's just a really fine noir novel that modern readers are going to enjoy, and you should definitely check it out since Starkhouse has reprinted it. So finally, the last thing I want to talk about is I've been corresponding a lot lately, up until even today, with this Canadian guy named Alex, who has a reprint publishing house called Ferox, F-E-R-O-X Books, that's been resurrecting a lot of these rare sleaze novels, as well as general crime, suspense, and horror fiction into these beautiful new editions with original art intact. Alex tells me he started Ferox when he was 18 years old, when he saw a real opportunity to reproduce these sleaze books. He explained that unlike crime fiction, where the authors retained the intellectual property rights to the books, sleaze fiction was generally work-for-hire gigs for the authors. The publishing houses own the content, many of which are now out of business, and even when they were in business, they failed to properly comply with copyright laws at the time. So their back catalog has fallen into the public domain, which allows people like Ferox to reprint them as modern paperbacks and ebooks. They reprinted a book called Satan is a Lesbian. The company's doing 2 or 3 releases per month while Alex remains a full-time university student. Ferox has uncovered and released 2 sleaze novels by Ed McBain.
Wow.
Yeah, Evan Hunter. One's called Has Been, and the other's called Sin Hungry. They're releasing them as doubles. Ferox has also reprinted 2 Donald Westlake sleaze books, Man Hungry and Passion Doll. They also have straight-up vintage crime books, including The Murder Kick by Wenzel Brown, which you just got in paperback. We were looking at it right before we went on the air. And Invitation to Violence by Lina White. If you search Ferox Press on Amazon, you can see the entire catalog. I think he also has a website. He's a pretty impressive guy, this Alex fella. And I just appreciate anybody who's involved in the cultural preservation of vintage paperbacks. So taking a look at sleaze fiction, the question is it worth your time? And I just don't know. I mean, there's certainly some lost gems scattered among the genre, like the Whittingtons I had a chance to review. I think these books, though, are mostly interesting for their curiosity's sake. These were young guys getting their start. Like, I'm such a Lawrence Block fan. It's interesting to me to read stuff when he was like a young, starving guy. Alex, this guy in Canada, tells me that they were only making about $700 a book, so speed writing was paramount for these guys to make the rent so they could get on to the next book. As a result, as you can imagine, the story writing quality suffers. The couple Lawrence Block books I read from this era of his life were not his finest work. These were not good books. They were kind of boring because it wasn't like they were leading up to graphic sex, and the stories weren't all that compelling. There's a whole subculture of people, though, who are absolutely obsessed with the illustrators who did the cover art for these books, the quality of which varies very wildly. I'm not an art expert at all. My suggestion is that if you want to read sleaze fiction, don't spend much. Maybe read an ebook to see if these are for you. Later, when I do my review, I'm going to discuss a guy who was a heavyweight in the sleaze genre named Ori Hitt. He's a name to know for fans of femme fatale crime fiction that masquerades as sleaze fiction. Anyway, so I want to point to a couple sources for this feature. I looked up information at bookscans.fatcow.com. There's vintagesleazepaperbacks.wordpress.com. Justin Marriott, our friend, has a fanzine that he produces regularly called The Sleazy Reader. And anything to add about sleaze fiction, Eric?
Well, I was going to ask you a question. It may not even be related. Would you say that the sibling subgenres, some genres of sleaze would be the teenage delinquent and or the swamp girl kind of genres?
Yeah, that's a good question because we talked about before this episode what we're going to do in 2020, and I'd like to do an episode on swamp noir, and there was definitely some of them that veered into sleaze fiction. I think a lot of it was based on the idea that there's these super hot hillbilly girls that you can outsmart and trick into bed. They were often, though, packaged as crime when you rip the lid off them like Charles Williams. They're like crime novels. And I think the juvenile delinquent subgenre of books, and there's actually a Facebook group for juvenile delinquent fiction that I'm a member of, definitely drew on some of this stuff, some of the delinquency where these girls acting out sexually. But I think the sleaze fiction, it was just a little more explicit about what it was. I think, listen, a lot of the crime novels you see surrounding us here in the library have these lurid covers, and hard case crime, their best-selling books have women falling out of their skirts and dresses and stuff like that. And so everyone's trying to draw on sex, but I think sleaze was just something unto its own. I don't think they called it sleaze fiction at the time. I think that's a term that we've invented for our generation to sort of categorize the books in this thing. The publisher also matters too. I think something published by Beacon is a whole lot different than something published by an Ace Double that just happens to have a sexy cover.
Right.
Yeah. So you're going to talk about your review?
Yeah, let's talk about...
Yeah, you talk for a while. My mouth's getting tired.
Yeah, you go get a drink of water. So let's talk about Lead With Your Left by Ed Lacey. And we've covered several of Ed Lacey's novels here on Paperback Warrior. You can read them in the review archives that I mentioned earlier in the intro. Ed Lacey was a pseudonym used by Leonard Zinberg. And man, Ed Lacey just sounds so much better. He had a solid run in 1950s and 1960s crime paperbacks. One of his most notable works is the 1957 novel Room to Swing, which introduced one of the early African-American crime fiction heroes in Toussaint Moore, a private investigator in New York City. But in 1957, Lacey also authored Lead With Your Left. It was first published in hardback by Harper, then later as a paperback by Pocket Books. There's a lot of reprints of the novel, including Corgi, which, in my opinion, has one of the better covers. The novel was reprinted in 2018 by Starkhouse Press with another Lacey novel called The Best That Ever Did It, and you can still purchase an affordable copy of that, and I certainly urge you to do so. But the book's protagonist is Dave Wintino, and he's this young baby-faced detective in New York City. His wife, Mary, she really hates his line of work, and the two have these heated arguments all through the novel about Mary wanting Dave to pursue this lucrative work with her uncle in some fabricating business. Dave doesn't want to do that. But Dave likes law enforcement, even with its low wages. She finds it to be meaningless work. She thinks it's classless, and she'll often hide the fact that her husband's a cop to her friends and peers. She'll have these parties, and she will either not invite him or not bring up his name, and certainly not bring up his profession because she was sort of ashamed of him. But to add more frustration to Dave's life, his co-workers at the precinct refuse to accept his validity due to him being so short and young. So he's this little short, baby-faced rookie, and they just don't accept him. So no matter where where life takes him, he's facing this this opposition. But we quickly learn that Dave is also an ex-Army vet, and he's an ex-boxer, which I'll stop and mention that a lot of Ed Lacey's novels feature boxing, ex-boxers or revolving around boxing. Dave has an iron will to complete a job or an assignment, really at any cost. So the focus of the novel is Dave's case regarding this murdered retired detective. The man was shot in an alleyway, and the young detective takes it upon himself to solve the crime both on and off the clock. And his work really never stops. He's working around the clock, not getting paid for half of his work. But he soon starts to put together the clues that this murdered detective put away this really high-profile mobster years ago. So when Dave's partner is murdered, things really take a twist, and Lacey's narrative reaches its frenzied pace at this point. There's an interesting side story with Dave assisting this young female journalist, and she's being harassed by this company that she's going to expose. And I think that story sort of offsets the main storyline and really gives Lacey a little bit more room to work with his creative vision, and he really lets the two storylines flourish around the characterization of Dave. But overall, this is a fantastic novel. It really impressed me a lot, and I've got a great deal of novels to work through, but so far, in my opinion, he's probably a top echelon writer to me. Tom, I guess, along with Dan Marlowe, David Goodis, and John McDonald. And I guess I'll throw Harry Whittington in there as well, but I don't know if Whittington is Whittington a household name like Goodis?
No, not at all. He should be, but he's not.
Yeah, he's just not, so I can't really put him in there. But
he made up for it in volume, though.
Yeah.
Now, Ed Lacey, do you ever read Room to Swing?
Yeah, I just read Room to Swing a few months ago.
You didn't like it, though, huh?
It was okay. It gets praised so much.
It is. I think it's hype because it was the first book with like a black private eye, right?
It's really, really boring. I mean, he takes an assignment. He goes into the South. He investigates. There's nothing really.
I think it's probably looked at as being amazing because it was so groundbreaking at the time. The idea of Leonard Zinberg actually was in an interracial relationship. His wife was black,
right?
And so, which again in the 1950s was unheard of. Now it doesn't even turn any heads, but back then it was really something.
Yeah, a lot of his novels feature that kind of relationship. I think I want to say it was Blonde Bait.
Okay,
and it mentions the same kind of
very sympathetic black characters.
Yes,
they're not cartoonish.
So.
It's not Amos and Andy.
But I think the Room to Swing sequel, which the name escapes me right now,
I can't remember either.
But he sets the story in Mexico, so he kind of flips it around. It's not in New York; it's in Mexico, which I'm kind of interested to read that just to see if it's any better. But again, this is Lead with Your Left by Ed Lacey. I definitely would recommend checking it out.
All right, good. Well, let's go back in the world of sleaze more generally. I'm going to do a review of The Widow by Ori Hitt.
Good.
A little bit of background. Upstate New York resident Ori Edwin Hitt wrote his first novel when he was 39 years old and continued cranking out what we now call sleaze fiction for about 14 years through the 1950s and 1960s. He was actually a family man with a wife and 4 kids. He died young at the age of 59 in 1975. His work is often dismissed as being sleaze fiction, and people say that in a derogatory fashion, but this designation fails to recognize just the fundamental truth that this guy was a superb writer, and that his plots often incorporated noir and crime fiction elements besides softcore sex scenes. I think his books are really more about the human condition than about sex. These were really just femme fatale noir novels. He and his 1950s publisher, Beacon Books, the sleaze paperback his sleaze paperbacks always featured lurid painted covers with the promises of hot, sexy action inside the pages. But by today's standards, the description of sex acts in these novels are pretty tame. Like chests heave and bodies grind, but private parts of their functions are never mentioned specifically. The books succeed or fail really based on the quality of the writing and the stories that justify the erotic situations, and that's why Hitt's books are still in print today. Starkhouse Books has reprinted 2 of his classics in one volume, Wayward Girl from 1960 and The Widow from 1959, with an introduction by the guy named Brian Greene. The Widow was originally packaged with this weird, rapey-looking cover and the tagline, "The savage story of a man gone wrong and a woman who led him astray." In fact, like I said, it's just a very compelling femme fatale noir novel that's going to be very similar in structure to the Fawcett Gold Medal paperbacks of Harry Whittington or Gil Brewer or Day Keane. The book stars a Lothario loser named Jerry, who suddenly finds himself terminated from his ditch-digging job after punching out his supervisor. He meets this impossibly sexy married woman named Linda, who's neglected by her mechanic husband. Linda sets Jerry up with a job working for her mother-in-law, a mean old lady who owns the local cabin motel and diner. This evolves into some heavy-duty sexual tension between Jerry and Linda, as well as a murder plot to swipe the old lady's nest egg. More than his contemporaries, Ori Hitt really knew how to dial up the erotic intensity of the stories to maximum volume without ever being graphic. It's a sexy novel. It's not explicit at all. It's just a trick. He's able to write this crisp, dialogue-driven book, very much like Lawrence Block's style. But it's just really the story of a guy planning to kill off his girlfriend's mother-in-law to try to get the inheritance money and make a widow of her. It's an easy recommendation if you want to kill a few hours with an erotic crime novel. I can't recommend this book enough. So that was The Widow by Ori Hitt. I would definitely recommend checking out my review on paperbackwarrior.com and check out the book itself. And like I said, it's an easy reprint. We've reached the end of November, Eric.
We've reached the end of November. This week is Thanksgiving. And before you say anything else, though, I got to ask you a question.
Lay it on me.
All right, so I'm staring at these. We're recording at Tom's library again. I'm staring at these books over here that are in a neat little line, and they're red and yellow. What in the world are those?
Okay, so there was a company, it still exists, they're not doing as much work. It's called Armchair Fiction. And Armchair Fiction is basically taking public domain, sometimes I think they have permission, books, like a lot of Fawcett Gold Medal books, and release them like Ace Doubles did with two novels. And they released them as trade paperbacks, and every year they would have a sale for you got I don't know, 20 doubles for like $99 or something like that. And so I bought into that a bunch. And so I have them, but because they're trade paperbacks, I got to put them on a normal shelf. And so they have the nice little line up there, and they look sharp.
Yeah, you've got about 25 there.
Yeah, one half's yellow, one half's red. A lot of the books which I review, we always try to post the vintage cover on the Paperback Warrior site, but I'm trying to work my way through those collections. They did a really nice job, and instead of spending a fortune on it, I can have a crisp new copy.
But anyway, I changed the subject there, but end of November. It was a great month.
Yeah, do you remember any books you read this month that were particularly good?
I'm brain dead right now. I think what was it called? Doomsday Squadron, I think, maybe. Double Cross Squadron, I really liked a lot. Gosh, I'm brain dead. I can't
No problem.
think.
I got three. Let me point you in the direction of those. I reviewed it on the show, so I'm not going to belabor it. A Cry in the Night by Whit Masterson was one of my favorite November reads. I reviewed it on an earlier episode. It's basically a compressed time police procedural novel about a girl kidnapped by a sex maniac by Bob Wade and Bill Miller, writing as Whit Masterson. They also write a lot of books under the name of Wade Miller. I really loved a book, and I may actually do a whole separate review on this, called The Long Ride by James McKimmey. It's this awesome book about a rideshare situation long before Uber, where an undercover FBI agent and a bank robber are in the same car, driven by some little old lady on a cross-country trip across America. It is just so good. You can check out the review that posted on Paperback Warrior back in November 22. And the last one that is reviewed on November 27, so 2 days from this podcast coming out, is Operation Murder by Lionel White. It's a heist novel that's being reprinted by Starkhouse with an introduction by Ben Bolden. And I want to do a feature on Lionel White in 2020 after reading Ben's intro, because he did a real nice job. So that's all I got. Is there anything else that jumps out at you?
Yeah, I was just trying to remember what I read. I read so much stuff. It's hard to even remember, but I was looking back at this. Yeah, I think it was... Bloody Jungle by Charles Runyon.
Yeah, you like that, right?
I really like that a lot. And there's this post-apocalyptic series that I've been reading. There's only 4 books called Waste World. And I read the 3rd book and really enjoyed it a lot. I ordered the 4th book. I spent a little bit of money I shouldn't have spent on it, but I just needed to finish the story, so I've got that on the way. That's really it. I hope everyone has safe travels this week wherever you're going to spend the holiday.
Yeah, get some reading done. Get away from your family. They're going to drive you nuts anyway, so you might as well curl up with a paperback book on the porch or something.
That's much better than football.
All right, man. Thank you so much, and we will see you in December.